to part 2 of lecture number 20. So we're going to jump all the way to slide number 51. We're going to start talking about food now. And so this is another issue that is kind of cropping up as our human population gets larger and larger. With more people, you need more food. And unfortunately, the amount of farmable land is not growing. And there are other negative impacts with agriculture that we're going to get into here in just a second. And that is partly around how we practice agriculture these days. We tend to make monocultures, at least in this country we do. And a monoculture is where you're essentially growing only one thing in a huge stand or in a huge field, like corn, for example, or soy, or other things, or wheat. But that is not a very natural way to do things. You don't find monocultures in nature, and there's a reason for that. The more diverse a system is, the more resistant it is to disease, or to blight, or parasites. Monocultures are very susceptible to these sorts of things. And so in order to get a monoculture to work, you have to pour huge amounts of fertilizer and pesticides onto your crops. And both of these things, fertilizers and pesticides, are made with fossil fuels. So monoculture's not natural, and to keep it not natural, you have to use supplements like fertilizers and pesticides. And really, in this country, the majority of our crops come down to only 4 things. Can you guys name the 4 most common things to grow in our country? That's it right there: corn, soybean, and cotton. Those are the top 3. You've probably heard of those. Then there's rapeseed oil, and rapeseed is what you use for canola oil. Okay, so those are the big 4 things in our country. And what are the problems with modern day agriculture in creating these monocultures is that you never, it's really hard. Nowadays we actually have technology to help us with over-irrigation, but up until very recently, over-irrigation was a huge problem. And you want to make sure that your plants get enough water. Well, you don't want to underwater them. And maybe you don't know what the exact right amount is, so what do you have to do? You have to overwater them. And that's the only way to guarantee that your plants are getting all the water they need. The problem with this is that it actually institutionalizes overuse of water. Now, how does our government deal with this? You might think that the government might tell a farmer to be more efficient, right? Stop using excess water, use only what you need. However, that's not how our government gives water rights. If you as a farmer want to have more water in the future, well, the government is going to allocate the water based on how much you used last time. That's right. So if you were wasteful last time, that becomes your benchmark for how much water they're going to give you this time. So it's actually in the best interest of the farmer to waste as much water as they can, to be guaranteed to get more water in the future. This is clearly backwards, and this is one of the things that is leading to some major water wars in this country, and especially in California. Also, food production draws heavily on fossil fuels, so energy consumption is a huge part of this. Also, agriculture has combined to this massive soil loss issue, which we have mentioned before. Water and soil are interchanged. They're locked together. So this has really created a massive conundrum for us. And, really, why are we doing this? Why are we using our land in this way? It's really because we have such a huge population of people. And there have been attempts to try and utilize that land in ways to get it to produce even more food than it normally would in nature, and hence the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is actually something from our past. It's now many decades in our past, at least 4 decades. And now recently, combining that with genetic engineering, Green Revolution, which really was an attempt to breed plants that produced an excessive amount of food, more than their natural cohort would, and then also combine that with genetic engineering to actually coax out of the DNA more food production than would be normal. And Now, the problem with this is that on that same plot of land where before you were having normal crops growing, you are now pouring huge amounts of water and fertilizer nutrients into it. And this has created a vicious cycle of depletion of nutrients in the soils to where now you actually can't grow crops on that land unless you put fertilizer on it because it's so depleted. You also have to use huge quantities of water in usually an inefficient way. And we now know these genetically engineered plants as GMOs, or genetically modified foods. So GMs, so genetically modified foods, are kind of being shied away from by those in the sustainability movement because they don't view this as an ethical approach to food. Um, Primarily because the companies that do most of the genetic modification of food, they program seeds to only give one crop. For example, if you buy genetically modified corn from a company like Cargill, for example, you can look them up. Cargill is one, Monsanto's would be another, and okay, great, you take their crops and they grow nice big corn, but you can't collect the seeds from the corn that you just grew and grow them next season. They actually program these seeds to die, to not be able to essentially carry out meiosis properly to create a seed that can be grown. So is that fair? Is that correct? Is that right? Well, that's the controversy there, is whether or not it's right. And now this actually extends into our meat and poultry production as well. You're actually looking at a livestock feed operation here in the town of Coalinga, which, if you've ever driven up through I-5 to the Bay Area, trust me, you've probably smelled it before you even arrived at it. Cows and herding animals, grazing animals, do not feed this way in nature. Um, they don't feed corralled like that in huge densities. They're usually out in pasture land on the grass. So this is an unnatural way for these animals to live, and to keep these animals surviving in this unnatural way requires a lot of other stuff, right? It's very energy intensive. It is a huge source of pollution and disease. And if you are interested in the environmental impacts or effects of this kind of farming practice or industrial farming practice, I suggest this book right here, Animal Factory by David Kirby, which came out in 2010. Um, it produces, this sort of operation produces lots and lots of problems. I've only listed 4 here. There's actually a lot more. Methane gas, both in what passes out the back end of the cow, but also what cows belch is a big issue. Bacterial runoff. I mean, you could die from a lot of the bacteria that get bred on these sorts of industrial operations. Antibiotic resistance. This is another important thing, is to keep these animals from getting sick too quickly, because they're in far greater density than it would exist in nature. They have to pump them full of antibiotics, because normally populations get sick when you put them in these densities. And then, of course, the odor issue is inescapable for many people. Okay, this is on land, but the effect is also being felt in the ocean, in fact, even more so in the ocean. The story is even worse there. You are looking at a scene from the Tsukiji fish market in Japan, and you're looking at tuna that are all on the market here. And this is another very important source of protein for a lot of people, provides lots and lots of protein. The difference between tuna and what you might find on pasture, like a cow or a lamb, these animals are wild. They are not farmed. And we are essentially depleting a wild population far faster than they can reproduce. And if you are interested in looking at overfishing, I highly recommend, for those of you that have a Netflix account, or if you are next to your public library, rent the movie End of the Line. End of the Line is a fantastic movie talking all about the extinction of fish populations in the open ocean. The one group of animals on this planet that is most at risk of going extinct, not species, but group of animals, are fishes. Fishes are going extinct at an alarming rate simply because they taste good, and we have the means to get every single last one of them out of the ocean. So let me talk a little bit about fish stocks. This is a typical graph of fish stocks, and the problem is that they are all essentially going extinct as a result of overfishing. Let me explain this graph to you because it says a lot. If you go back to 1950 and you were to look at the catch data from that point, that is, look at the data that all the fisheries, the fisheries industry has kept on what they caught, how much of it they caught by tonnage, and all of that, you would find that of all the things that we eat today, those fish back in 1950 were largely underdeveloped or only partly developed as far as the fishery goes. That is to say, let's say if we follow this axis up here, we get to about 50%. It means that of all the fish that we eat today, 50% of those were completely underdeveloped as a fishery back in 1950. And in fact, if we continue with this, that's almost like 35–40% of the fish that we eat today had only just begun to be developed as a resource, and only about 10–12% actually was being fully exploited with a full-on industry going. For those that have read the book Cannery Row up in Monterey Bay, that would be one of the few fisheries that was well underway to being fully exploited. But if you track these fish that we so prize, that we like to eat today, and you look at the trends of how many of them were either underdeveloped, developed, fully exploited, overexploited, or the populations had actually crashed to economic extinction, today we're looking at no fish populations being either underdeveloped or developed, and a huge chunk of them being either fully exploited, overexploited, or in fact, we have somewhere around 25–30% of all fish stocks have crashed. 25–30% of all of them have crashed. So some researchers very recently asked the question, well, if we follow this trend out into the future, and we notice that this line here, this red line, is dropping and dropping and dropping, that is to say that all the fisheries that have crashed are increasing in number, at what point will this red line cross zero, where 100% of the fisheries are now crashed? Well, that's actually not too hard. All you got to do is take a ruler, and assuming nothing changes, that we continue to fish the way we are, you can draw a line and just carry it out. Let's carry it all the way out to 2050. And it turns out that if everything remains the same, if nothing changes, our behavior doesn't change, every fish stock that we normally fish for commercially will be extinct in about 2048. 2048, folks. How many of you plan to be alive in 2048? Hopefully most of you. And that's not that far into the future, considering the year it is now. So this is certainly a very, very important thing that we need to deal with in the near future. The reality is that we have the means and to fish everything out of the ocean, and we are having a really hard time saying no to ourselves. We are having a hard time keeping our finger off that button. We can't help ourselves. This is a Chilean purse seiner. This is one of 12 that probably operates in Chile on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis. This is a huge amount of fish being removed from the ocean, far faster than this species can recover on its own. And, this is ultimately what is going to result in the demise of all fish species on the planet, or at least those that we commercially consume. Now, this brings up a very important point. This slide is going to be on the final exam. I want to explain a concept to you called tragedy of the commons. This actually comes to us from our colleagues over in economics. I have here that it's listed as a social trap because it's like a vicious cycle here. Let me explain to you how tragedy of the commons works, kind of in an analogous way. I've got a picture here of a kingdom, let's say, that has built up a big wall here to keep out the masking marauders. So let's go ahead and answer the question of what is a commons. Okay, what are the common areas? Well, if you've ever lived in an apartment or in a condo, for example, the common area is the area kind of in the middle, the grassy area in the middle where the pool is, where everybody gets to walk their dog and walk around. It's the area that you all share. Okay? Your apartment or your condo, that's your private area. Everything else is the commons. And the question then is, well, what's the tragedy all about? Well, it has to do with one thing that you probably have already figured out by now, but another one which you're just now learning about. It has to do with human population growth and our demand for resources. The fact that the human population is growing exponentially, and yet our resources that we demand are not growing exponentially. And that is going to create a huge tragedy in the future, or it already is actually in many countries. So I want to kind of explain it this way. Imagine that this is your kingdom and you are the benevolent king or queen, and you're going to take your land inside your kingdom, which is a finite amount of area, and that's your commons there. You're going to divide your commons up, and you're going to divide it evenly among all of your royal subjects. So each family gets a little plot of land. And on that plot of the land, the husband and wife and their children work that land and try and be productive. Maybe they grow crops. Maybe they send a cow out to pasture on their land, and they let it kind of go out there for about 3 or 4 hours a day to eat some grass, and so you can milk them, right? Okay, but let's say you have 4 children, and all 4 of your children want to get married, right? Well, let's say they all get married. Now, what are they going to do? If they don't want to leave the castle, or they don't want to leave the kingdom, what do you, as a reasonable parent, do with your land? Let's say you want to retire. Well, the reasonable thing to do is to take your land and divide it up into quarters and give each of your children one of the quarters, right? Kind of like that. The problem is that they're a family just like you were. They're going to have children too, except they are being expected to be just as productive on a quarter amount of land as you were on a much larger amount of land. So in order to get that amount of productivity out of a smaller plot of land, they have to farm it harder. They have to use fertilizers now to get this thing to produce. They have to send their cow out there who has less area to feed. They actually have to have that cow out there feeding twice as long to get as much nutrients out of this, which depletes the nutrients even further. So now you got to use more fertilizers and pesticides and noxious chemicals, which end up hurting your environment and hurting your family. So it's a vicious cycle whereby because the amount of resource is not growing, in this case the land, but the population is increasing, those two conflict and they clash. And this can lead to lots of problems. It can lead to economic, social, and environmental collapse. That's what the tragedy means. And the problem is that it actually encourages destructive behavior by the way that it is designed. So we have to come up with better solutions, better ways to manage our lands in a more sustainable way. And these are fisheries here that are essentially experiencing tragedy of the commons. Once you get a huge boat that's able to fish all of these fish out of the water, or crabs in this case, well, now there's fewer species down there for you to grab, fewer individuals for you to grab. So what do you do in response? You buy twice as many nets, twice as many hooks, twice as many boats to try and get the few remaining fish. And it's a vicious cycle. So that's the tragedy of the commons. And this has really been allowed to occur because of a transition in our society. We went from being hunter-gatherers, and the hunter-gatherer way of life can only support a very small number of people. And yet, by agriculture or industrial agriculture, we have been able to increase our population and sustain them throughout their lives. And when it comes to the ocean, though, when it comes to fish, we have this hunter-gatherer mentality where we're going to go out into the ocean and simply grab everything we can as fast as we can and turn around and sell it as fast as we can. So we still go out there with a hunter-gatherer mentality, but we have industrial capabilities unlike what our ancestors, who were actually hunter-gatherers, had. So we have this industrial ability to strip our resources far faster than they can replenish themselves. And ultimately, this is destructive because it's not being driven by the biology, where, for example, a scientist would say, no, you can't take that much. You have to take a smaller amount, otherwise it won't be there in the future. That's not what is driving the decision making. Decision making is being driven by economics. Got to grow that industry. We have got to grow that economy. But the problem is that the economy cannot grow forever. It is a misnomer to think that economics will allow for exponential growth forever. It's just not going to happen. So introducing us now to a new term, a new, very important concept. This will also be on the final exam. Bycatch, and this is a very important term here too. Bycatch refers to all of the animals that just happen to be in the way of your net or just happen to grab onto your hook, but are not the thing that you were fishing for. It ends up dying too, even though you didn't intend to catch it. In some instances, like for example in shrimp fishing, you end up having to kill 5 pounds of other stuff for every 1 pound that you collect and sell to somebody who wants to eat shrimp. Now, you think about that. If you've ever eaten a pound of shrimp, realize that if it was caught with an industrial trawling net, that 5 pounds of something else that you will never even see had to die in order for you to enjoy that 1 pound of shrimp. Not a very efficient or effective way to go shrimp fishing. And this ultimately leads to fisheries collapse, this sort of behavior. And I want to introduce you to something called the Ali effect. The Ali effect. Okay, I'm drawing a graph here, and this is a graph that you will probably see on the final exam. On the x-axis, we have time. So as you go from the left to the right, you're increasing in time. You're going into the future. And fish population size is on the y-axis here. This dotted line that's drawn here is called the sustainability line. And as long as you are above the sustainability line, your population is going to survive and will recover. Up until about the mid-1980s, this curve right here, this curve that you see up here on the top, is how we used to think about fish population growth. That is to say, if your population is growing like this, let's say it's all the way up here, then all you got to do is, let's make a few bucks here. We're going to go out and catch some fish industrially. So we're going to fish for them and fish for them and fish for them. We're going to remove them from the ocean and keep selling them and keep selling them and keep fishing for them until their population gets down to about right here. And then we'll just stop fishing for them. Yeah, their population's low, but we'll let them grow back all the way to here. And we'll start fishing for them again. No problem, right? Except fish populations don't grow this way. And it took a mathematician by the name of Ali to figure out how populations actually grow. And you probably already recognize the curve I'm about to show up here. Fish populations actually grow like this, right? You guys recognize that? An S curve, logistic growth. We discussed that in the population growth lecture. Notice that a portion of this curve actually dips underneath the sustainability line. This is called the Ali effect. It means by our old way of thinking, we would have been fishing and fishing and fishing and fishing and fishing and fishing until we fished the population down to this size. Then we figure, oh, we'll just stop fishing and we'll let the fish recover. The problem is that now you're under the sustainability line. This population is going to continue to shrink and shrink until it gets to there. And what do we call that? That's called extinction. Yes, or complete annihilation of this species. In other words, it is possible to fish a population down to a level that it is now basically beyond recovery. It is not possible for it to recover for a whole myriad of reasons. But just one example would be you have now driven the population to such low densities that the males and the females of the species are not encountering each other often enough to replenish themselves. And they end up dying faster than they can make babies. That is the Ali effect. So make sure you know the difference between this graph and this graph. And make sure that you can explain that difference and how the Ali effect actually describes the way populations grow. So that's a good example there. And we did talk about food chains and food webs and how those interact. But now we want to talk about whole system effects in that respect of food chains and food webs. You see, when you create an environmental imbalance by removing a species, for example, these fish, overfishing, it creates lots and lots of other problems for the entire system. One classic case here is the killer whale up in Alaska. Um, Killer whales are, they're predators up in the Arctic. They normally eat seals and sea lions, but in the mid 1980s, the killer whale population started doing something very strange. They started eating sea otters. Now, they don't normally eat sea otters, so what's the big deal here, and why is that important? Well, it turns out sea otters are very important. Sea otters love to eat sea urchins. Sea urchins are these little creatures that right here that live on the bottom of these rocky reefs. Sea urchins love to eat kelp. And when you have sea otters in your system, then you don't have a huge amount of sea urchins because any urchin that's out and about is going to get eaten. Only those urchins that can hide in the cracks and crevices and try and stay out of the way are going to survive. So you end up with a healthy system with all three here, right? As long as you have these sea otters. Well, when the orcas came in, when these killer whales came in and started eating sea otters, well, that took the pressure off of the sea urchins. The sea urchins began to dramatically increase in population size. And when that happened, they began to mow down the kelp forests. Kelp started getting dramatically depleted because there was nothing down here eating the urchins. And the problem is that having lots and lots of kelp is important. Having that three-dimensional structure down on the bottom of the ocean, it actually attracts diversity. So lots of animals live around and in the kelp beds. So when you eliminate the kelp beds, you eliminate that huge amount of diversity associated with it. And all of this by just eliminating one species, that keystone species. We used that term before, keystone species. Well, should we get down on these orcas for eating these sea otters? Isn't that a natural occurrence? Not necessarily. It turns out, and it took a lot of research on the part of some people up in Alaska to figure this out, that the reason why these orcas were eating the otters is because their natural food source, the seals and the sea lions, were disappearing. Well, you might ask, why did the seals and the sea lion populations begin to decrease? They decreased because the thing they eat, basically fish, in this case mostly salmon, but other fish, were being overfished by humans. So that's very interesting. It turns out that the loss of kelp beds was directly related to human activities. Humans overfished the salmon. No more salmon for seals and sea lions. So seal and sea lion populations crash as a result of that, leaving no food for the orcas, the killer whales, who in desperation switch from eating seals and sea lions to now eating otters. Well, an otter is a whole lot smaller than a sea lion, so you got to eat a whole bunch of otters to make a meal of it. And now that puts an added stress on it because now the sea urchins begin to explode in numbers. You lose your kelp forest as a result of that, and you lose your diversity. So this system here is what is known as a trophic cascade. Now, I haven't written that down here, but you need to know that. A trophic cascade is where one effect at the upper reaches of the food chain end up creating a whole myriad of effects down below. Okay, so keep that one in mind. So what are we going to do with our fisheries? Well, it's a good question indeed. Fisheries management really is what we have to do, right? Well, what is fisheries management? Well, I have it as this obligatory interplay of economics, politics, and science. You, as a science-minded person now, might say, well, which of these three should be used first in making fisheries management decisions? You would think it should be the science, right? Because the scientists are out there telling you what the population size is, how fast they reproduce, so you can only take this amount so that you don't deplete the population. And you'd be wrong. Unfortunately, the science is not what drives the management decisions. It's usually driven by economics or politics, which is really unfortunate. So we definitely need more proactive laws. Instead of instituting a law when a fish starts to go extinct, we need to be in there implementing laws before the fishery has ever even been opened. We need better fishing gear so that we are actually catching only the things that we intended to catch, okay, and not a whole bunch of other bycatch. We also need more public support, and that's primarily why you're taking this class, to learn a little bit about science and how science impacts your life. We do need more of the science, although we don't need, although we certainly already have enough science to act. But we definitely need international support. Why? Well, because we could write all the laws we want for our country. Doesn't necessarily mean that another country is going to follow our laws. So we need to find a way to write laws that are respected by all countries. And that's kind of a new approach, because then who's going to enforce that, right? It certainly is not an easy thing to answer. We also need to take an ecosystem approach to protection. Instead of trying to save the ocean one species at a time, we should be saving whole habitats, coral reefs, wetlands, ocean bottoms, and move that up onto land. You can even use the same analogy there. We need to save watersheds, but unfortunately there are no laws that protect ecosystems or habitats. There are laws that protect species that were written back in the 1970s, so that tends to be what lawyers latch on to instead of focusing on the habitat. So we need more ecosystem approaches towards management. You might say, well, what about farm raising? I mean, wouldn't that be the best thing to do, farm raise a fish? Well, you might think so, partly so. Um, and it really depends on what fish you are talking about. In the case of tilapia, yeah, it's actually kind of a good idea. Tilapia are raised in pens above ground. So actually, Arizona, they're raising lots of tilapia out there in the middle of the desert. But the nice thing about raising them in pens like this is that you have direct control over the water going in and the water coming out. You know your nutrient levels in there. You kind of can keep them at lower densities. You just need more pens, and you can take better care of the quality of the water. And like, it would be illegal to just take a bunch of fish poo and shovel it into your neighbor's yard. You actually have to be responsible for that. So tilapia is a very sustainable and environmental choice for eating. However, Atlantic salmon is not. It is probably one of the most destructive ways to farm an animal. In this case, all of that food waste and poo that you had to be responsible for up here, instead of making big pens like this, instead, Atlantic salmon business people, um, they actually lease areas of the fjords in either British Columbia or in other parts of the world where the pens are open. So they throw all of the fish in here, and all that waste and all of the debris ends up going right into the fjord, right into the waters that are out here. And essentially what this business practice is saying is, I don't have to be responsible for my environmental damage. I'm going to allow the environment to absorb all of my fish waste and lots of other things, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. So this is an irresponsible way to farm a fish. So I'm telling you right now, if you care about the environment, do not eat Atlantic salmon. It is one of the most destructive ways to fish. Okay, what is the issue with Atlantic salmon? There's a lot of issues. Number one, uncontrolled water flow. I kind of implied that last time, that all the water that, or all of the fertilizers, all of the food waste, all of the excrement that comes off of the fish, all of that essentially is free to move out into the surrounding waters. There are escape issues. You take a look at this pen here. What is the chance that these fish are going to be able to jump over the sides here? It's very high. And what ends up happening is the Atlantic salmon, which never evolved to live in some of these areas. I mean, British Columbia. You guys see the non sequitur there, right? British Columbia is not in the Atlantic. It's in the Pacific. So Atlantic salmon, if they get loose in these fjords, they begin taking over and outcompeting all of the native fishes that live there. And this is actually happening. Disease. You end up introducing new diseases into the surrounding population of native fishes. Crowding effects means and that, by the way, crowding these fish into these little pens actually enhances the disease process. And, well, how do you keep them from getting disease if they're in such close quarters? Well, it's like the cows. You got to pump them full of antibiotics. Well, do you think those antibiotics are going to stay just in your little pen? No. They're going to wash out and invade this entire surrounding water body here. And that in itself ends up breeding superbacterias and superbugs that then make your job even harder. You end up needing to pour even more antibiotics into the system. And ultimately, eutrophication is another big problem. Eutrophication refers to the unnatural addition of nutrients into a system. In this case, fish poo. Lots and lots of fish poo. Lots of excess food. All of that stuff essentially wafting into the surrounding environment. So what are you going to do as a conscious consumer? How do you know? And by the way, Atlantic salmon is just one example of one of the things you shouldn't eat. But tilapia is just one example of something that you should eat. Well, how are you supposed to keep track of all of this? You are going to be a conscious consumer. That's what you're going to do. And one way to do that is to go to this website here. This is the Monterey Bay Aquarium's website, and it's their Seafood Watch Guide. You can actually get a card that you can put in your wallet or in your purse, or even better, for those of you that have smartphones, you can actually download this free app. And this free app tells you when you're either in a restaurant or when you are in a supermarket, what fish should you buy? Well, you open it up and you look at the best choice list over here. These are all of the fish and other animals that you should just eat with complete relish. You should love this stuff over here. Buy as much of this as you want because it is all sustainably raised, and it's good for the economy and it's good for the environment. Everything over here in the red column, in the avoid column, these are the things where the fisheries practices are actually driving species to extinction or are destroying habitat or are unfair practices to the people and the fishermen themselves. So for example, you come over here to the best choice. Look at that, you can eat salmon as long as it's Alaska wild caught, because Alaskan wild caught salmon is very well managed as a fishery. However, if you come over to here, you look at, where's this one here? Where's the salmon? Avoid salmon farmed, including Atlantic. Don't eat Atlantic salmon. It is horrible for the environment. Eat Alaskan wild caught salmon. That is good stuff. And this is true also not just for the Seafood Watch Guide, but it turns out that they have one even for those of you that like sushi. So get the sushi guide too. There are things that you can eat that are not harmful to the environment, but there are the things over here that you should absolutely stay away from. They are not helpful to the environment. Okay, and as far as fisheries go, there's one group of fish in particular that are being decimated at an unprecedented rate. That would be sharks. Sharks are top predators, and they have been on this planet for over 430 million years. They have been the top predators on this planet for that long period of time, and yet only in the last few decades have they become a delicacy outside of Southeast Asia, and actually are now common in places like London, Southern California, all over the world, in fact. And this newfound fascination with shark fin soup is leading to the wholesale decimation of a top-level apex predator, and it is really going to put our ecosystems in a bad strait. These sharks are usually fished in a very inhumane way. They are brought up on board still alive. Their fins are cut off, and the animal carcass, still alive without its fins, is then thrown back in the ocean, where the animal is left to drown. Without its fins, it can't swim, and it will drown to death. That is a very inhumane way to fish. And you might say, well, why don't they just eat the whole fish? There's a reason why. Because these fins up here can fetch you up to $200 per pound. The shark meat itself is only going to fetch you about $1.25 per pound. So in the mindset of the fishermen, they would much rather just cut the fins off and not waste the space with the shark itself. And it is now illegal to trade in shark fin parts in California, and actually other states, including Hawaii and Washington, and a few others are now getting on the bandwagon as well. And there may even be a federal law passed in the next few years to ban the sale of shark fins in the United States. Um, and you know, this has really become associated as a status symbol for a lot of people, and it's supposed to be like a celebratory thing. And these are actually made up pictures here of a wedding party with the actual aftermath. If people saw what came from serving shark fin soup at a wedding, for example, and they saw this, maybe they'd think twice about doing it. But shark fin soup, yeah, it's fairly tasty stuff, but it tastes exactly like the broth that you cook it in. The shark fins are made of cartilage. Remember, these are chondrichthyes. Remember that term? They're cartilaginous fishes. So the cartilage is what's used to make the soup, and cartilage is tasteless. There is no taste in cartilage. So the taste comes from the chicken broth or the beef broth that you cook it in. And these things are going for up to $90 to $100 per bowl. So you can understand why this would become a status symbol piece to serve at a wedding, for example. Well, there's a lot of people, including in Southeast Asia, where this practice really has emerged, who are fighting against shark fin soup and asking people to not eat shark fin soup. And I am urging you now to consider never eating shark fin soup for the rest of your life. I have a video up that is actually showing some work that's being done in Southeast Asia by some Chinese conservationists who are urging other Chinese to not eat shark fin soup. And where did they get their sharks from? Well, most of Southeast Asia has already fished out their own sharks. So what do? They go to third world countries like Costa Rica and a few other countries, where the people in desperation are more than happy to fish out their sharks in order to make a few dollars to be able to support their families. But in the end, this is leading to the decimation of an entire group of animals on the planet that has survived massive extinctions over the last 430 million years. There are a lot of famous people that are also getting into the conservation movement, and one in particular who's very outspoken is Yao Ming. Now, whether you like his basketball team or not, the reality is he's a very prominent, well-respected Chinese man who is out on a limb essentially telling his countrymen, telling people all around the world, look, we don't have to be eating shark fin soup. So I'm not going to eat it, and I hope you won't too. So this is kind of the end of our resources lecture. We're going to now come back to human impacts in the next lecture, so I will see you all in cyberspace.